So welcome, and thank you for joining, and thank you to AdvaMed for giving us this opportunity to present a patient story through the eyes of a practicing clinician, Dr. Rahul Doshi. So I'm Chris Simon. I'm the CEO of Haemonetics, and I am delighted to be joined here by Dr. Doshi. Dr. Doshi is a highly established electrophysiologist practicing at Honor Health and also at the University of Phoenix Medical School in Scottsdale, Arizona. So, Dr. Doshi, fill in the details for us.
So thanks to everyone. It's a pleasure to obviously be here. So I am still a practicing electrophysiologist. That's still the majority of my time spent, and I've been in practice now for, this is what you never want to say, right? It's been 23 years for me. And so, gosh, like where does time go?
You started at 14 though, right?
Something like that. And I have been involved in pretty much every aspect of electrophysiology over this sort of rapid growth phase of electrophysiology. When I was in medical school and early training, we were confined to little rooms and closets and giving drugs and not much more than that. And then the explosion of both device therapy and certainly catheter ablation, especially for atrial fibrillation, has taken over everything that we do. And that is certainly the bulk of my practice is catheter ablation or procedures related to AFib, though I still do pretty much everything. And also have been involved in teaching programs and running academic programs previously, and now running a hospital system for electrophysiology or arrhythmia services. So that's what I do all day, every day, and it's great to be here.
Great. Again, thank you for joining. So your expertise and your reputation spans all of electrophysiology, but I'm going to ask you to drill down a bit on an aspect that's near and dear to us at Haemonetics, which is vascular closure in particular. How did you first become involved and help us and others drill down on that expertise?
So it's interesting, we obviously a large part of what we do is catheter based, and so anything that's catheter based in vascular access, you would think about vascular closure, but traditionally in electrophysiology, we're dealing more with the vein, right? Typically, for most catheter ablations or EP procedures, we're going in venous access and require perhaps not as robust closure systems as our colleagues that deal with the artery all day. Now, having said that, we certainly do. There are procedures that we have done traditionally with arterial access, and that's where I would say I, of course, got my first exposure to vascular closure is on the arterial side, because we would think that, you're doing a right-sided or a venous access procedure that doesn't require anticoagulation. Why do we really need to think about it? You hold manual pressure and that's all you need. Well, things have obviously evolved tremendously because of atrial fibrillation. So.
Great. Well, it's in everybody's memory, COVID disrupted everything we do. I watched with admiration the way the EP community responded. Take us into the dark days of COVID and how you stayed active and practicing and making all the things that are so critical to those AFib patients happen.
So I'm sure all of you are aware, for procedures that we do in cardiovascular medicine, there's lots of data across the spectrum that says that, these procedures should happen, right? And we all saw a decline in care access because of the pandemic. And it wasn't just the fact that, the hospital beds are full and you're not allowed to keep people in the hospital for theoretically elective or less emergent procedures, because you could make an argument that a lot of what we do is maybe urgent, not necessarily emergent. And those patients were literally being kept out of the hospital because if they required a bed, they couldn't come in. We just didn't have the bandwidth. But it was more than that. The patients also were declining to seek access to care. And we saw the spikes in things like fatality from myocardial infarction or from aortic stenosis with no TAVR procedures or whatnot. But certainly we had in the dark days of COVID, so here we have this explosion of patients who actually, COVID makes you have atrial fibrillation, by the way. But we have lots of patients that we want to take care of. And all of a sudden, we're told that we can't do those procedures unless those patients are going home the same day. Now, for those of us that were typically sending folks home the same day, okay, maybe a little bit of a pushback, because obviously you need to keep patients at bed for X amount of hours post-procedure, and so the throughput through the labs and the recovery areas was long. And so, maybe instead of doing 3 or 4 cases a day, we could do 1 or 2. But to try to maintain that access to care, we literally looked into and tried to develop strategies that we could send home patients faster, quicker, to increase our throughput and keep the patients from being admitted to the hospital. We were almost forced to do so for atrial fibrillation patients. And so that was what led us to pursuing vascular closure strategies for more rapid ambulation and discharge for our patients with atrial fibrillation. I would also remind everybody that as we've evolved, I mentioned that, venous pressure, not a big deal. Well, venous pressure with big sheets and uninterrupted anticoagulation, which has become the standard of care for all of our patients, okay, patients can bleed. And so that is something that we, so traditionally, if we say before we started using vascular closure, whether it's just manual compression and patients are at bed rest for 8 hours, or a figure of 8 stitch, which if anybody has ever taken care of or experienced themselves is not particularly pleasant. And even with larger sheets, we would literally send patients home with a figure of 8 stitch, have them come back to the office to have it removed. Very uncomfortable. Not to mention the time in the recovery areas was just too long. And so that led us to actually starting our program for same-day discharge with the use of vascular closure, with bed rest for 2 hours, home in 4 as sort of the standard of care. And that is what made a huge difference for us and allowed us to actually keep going, right? We were able to take care of our patients. As compared to some of our other colleagues, actually, for example, at TAVR, that could not. So
it was extraordinary to watch the patient-centric focus and how you and other EP labs across the country responded. Thankfully, it seems we're on the other side of it now, and certainly procedure volume would say we're on the other side of it. What have you retained from the COVID experience that was actually just a better standard of care? What's new and different that you're dealing with today in the aftermath of all this?
So the quick answer to what's retained now post-pandemic is, everything. We have not changed what we were doing because of the pandemic in one iota. In fact, we've noticed actually several things that have allowed us to think that this is a good strategy going forward in perpetuity. Certainly, the patient satisfaction bit is incredibly important, right? That there are patients, their discomfort is our business, and patients do markedly better from a pain standpoint post-procedure, and that's for certain. So that's the best win, right? And it turns out that patients actually like to get up out of bed, and getting them up sooner is a good thing. But we actually saw 2 other things that are equally important, or maybe almost as important. Number one is that, I think there was some hesitation in our community, at least globally, to send patients home the same day. I mean, way back in the day when I first started doing atrial fibrillation ablation, this was a big procedure, a big deal. And certainly there's that idea that, well, it's a complex procedure. I want to keep that patient overnight. Our utilization for same-day discharge prior to this technology was around 55, almost 60%. And then with this technology, because the practitioners found it easy, useful, effective, we're now north of 90% uniformly. We're around 93, 94% currently. And so that was huge, just in terms of that metric in general. And then finally, of course, the obvious one that is actually turns out very important is cost, right? The less time in the recovery units, less time obviously in the hospital, increased efficiency and throughputs through the system, less use of other things, like for example, if a patient doesn't have to be bed rest for a long time, they don't need a Foley catheter. All these things do add up as far as not just patient satisfaction, but plain and simple cost. And so we are saving money for the system. And actually, we've actually noted that very early on, and that's why there's been actually no issues going forward in maintaining this.
That's very impressive. It's the trifecta.
Yeah.
I'm going to drill down into that a little bit. So let's take you back to your first point around patients. When we developed and advanced some of our closure techniques, we knew it would benefit electrophysiologists, and we knew there was a health economics argument that we were going to be able to go develop. What we were a little taken aback by was the patient testimonials and how heavily that influenced the adoption. Can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing with your patients on this?
So I can tell you, having done this for years and years, and also utilizing things that have bigger sheath requirements, some of our ablation technologies, certainly appendage cases, and certainly more complex cases involving the artery, for example, VT ablation and such. Patients complain of that pain. In fact, it would be routine that patients would come back and see me after their ablation and said, oh yeah, everything was easy as can be, except the one thing I hated was when they went to remove that stitch. Over and over and over again, and that's simply now gone. The requirement for pain medications post-procedure is virtually now gone. Actually, the patients were not having all the robust pain post-catheter ablation because of pericarditis. It was mostly because of pain in the groin. And that's what they were getting there, whether it's their NSAIDs or their narcotics or whatnot, and that's gone away. And so, no, from the patient satisfaction standpoint, they're much happier, much, much happier.
The testimonials are really impressive. So let's jump to the other side of it. You mentioned health organizations, you mentioned the health economic argument. Break that down for us. What's the nature of the conversations you and your colleagues are having with lab directors, with hospital administrators, with the dreaded procurement department? Fill us in.
So in my area, at least what I am over for the service line is obviously all things to do with atrial fibrillation, and the fastest growing area for cardiovascular medicine is in fact catheter ablation for atrial fibrillation and other procedures related to that, like left atrial appendage occlusion. So with that, not only has our volumes grown year in, year out consistently, and are really just limited by actually lab access, because it's certainly not the patients, right? You talk about pandemic, this is an epidemic disease. And so that continues to grow, and it turns out that the hospitals like it too, because their margins for the procedure are very good. And so we drive a lot of revenue for the hospitals, and thus we are supported. And so increasing the efficiency and throughput for these procedures is important for them because they're just doing more business. It's important for us because we can take care of more patients. Obviously important for patients because they're getting taken care of. So
that's excellent. It reinforces a bit of the conversation we're having internally at Haemonetics around enabling technologies, other things to advance the standard of care. There's lots of interesting innovation is represented around this hall, but what else? What are we missing? How could we or other companies help more to enable your team to maximize and really deliver against your mandate?
So, I mean, obviously, if we're talking vascular closure, the bigger may not be better, but bigger is needed. Certainly, we have technologies that require larger sheath access, both in the vein and in the artery. And those procedures are going across not just electrophysiology, but structural heart and complex intervention. There's a need. There's still a tremendous need for this. And so development of newer technologies that can expand the number of patients that can be treated would be immensely helpful. So since I'm hearing that is actually some of what you are doing, it makes me very excited. So
great. Now, we appreciate that, and that is absolutely the focus. Final word, right? You've got the entire med tech industry represented here. What more can we be doing to help enable what you're doing with regards to advancing standard of care and with improving health economics? blue sky. Anything's fair.
Blue sky, right? So obviously every procedure that's better, safer, more efficacious, faster, cheaper is all good, right? So yeah, that's the 50,000-foot level. I actually think though that, I think we, especially as an electrophysiologist, we focus on that drill down on technology for what we're actually doing. So if it's catheter ablation for AFib, it's AFib ablation. It's the catheter and the mapping system and blah, 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 blah. Great, critically important, have to further innovation. But all the other things that go along with every single procedure, I think we tend to forget. So whether it's things like vascular access, or whether it's things like are, sort of associated or can help facilitate the procedure. I just had a conversation with my colleague regarding esophageal cooling, for example, which has increased our efficiency and efficacy for catheter ablation. There's lots of these technologies that we don't necessarily think of as this is what we're doing with ablation, but they help. And so I would say that's taking a global viewpoint is probably a good idea.
That's outstanding. I appreciate the advice, and thank you again for joining us. We'll have to leave it there.